.NET for Devices presents EvenTiles, Part 14, Communicating through Isolated Storage. Hello once again to EvenTiles. In Part 14 you're gonna see how we can properly communicate between an application and its periodic task by making use of isolated storage. In the previous part we already saw how to protect data against mutual access from both an application and its periodic task, but we also saw that it's not just possible simply to pass data by making use of some instance variables. So what we're going to do now is modify our tile data class. The first thing we are doing right now is add a constant string containing a file name, and we're going to use that file name to create a file in isolated storage, and the application can write to that file and the periodic task can both write and read from that file, and in that way we're going to try and pass data between the application and its periodic task, so we have the possibility to show information on a secondary tile. We're just going to use the same properties, and the last time we already created some private methods inside those properties to actually perform some functionality, and now you can see that that made a lot of sense. So here is one of those private methods, store secondary back content. It already is protected by a mutex against mutual access by the application and its periodic task. And the only thing we're going to do is add an additional private method. We're going to call that additional private method something like persist tile content. We don't need any parameters, and what we're gonna do is just store the value of the secondary back content and the boolean value of that show secondary back content property inside a file. If we want to retrieve that information from inside our periodic task, we're going to make use of yet another private method. We're going to call that retrieve tile content. Again, we don't need any parameters, but what we're going to do is just assign that secondary back content inside that retrieve file content method to the contents of a file that was stored in isolated storage. So here is that retrieve tile content, and we're also going to create a persist tile content method. Both are not returning anything and both are static methods, only accessible from inside the tile data class itself. So what we're going to do right now is get access to our isolated storage to store information, and one of the things an application and its periodic task share is in fact the isolated storage area. So if we are just going to make use of the isolated storage, we have a way for the application and its periodic task to share data between each other. So what we're going to do is make use of the isolated storage file class. We're going to call the getStoreForApplication method on it, which is a static method, and what we're going to pass there is nothing. We're going to make use of a using statement, so we automatically dispose of the object once we don't need it anymore, and we're going to store that isolated storage area in a variable store. Then we're gonna make use of a stream writer stream, and that stream writer, what we're gonna do there is actually we're gonna use that to store the contents of both properties inside our tile data class. To that stream writer, what we're gonna pass is the file stream of the file that we are creating in isolated storage, and that file has a name being specified by content file name. Again, we're going to make use of a using statement here, again to not worry about disposing the object once we don't need it anymore. And then what we're going to do is simply write the show default secondary back content property to that file, but since we are making use of a text file, what we are going to do there is convert that particular property to a string value, and then the next thing we're going to do, we terminate that particular string value by a new line, and then we're also going to write the secondary back content to the file. So each time the application modifies the string that needs to be displayed on that secondary tile, what's happening inside the application is that the application calls properties on tile data and thus stores the information inside a file that is available in isolated storage. Now, to retrieve tile content from the periodic task, we're going to do something similar, but this time we're not going to write data to a file, but we're going to read data from that same file that we created earlier on. So if we have access to our isolated storage, which by the way is shared between the application and its periodic task, then what we're going to do is verify if a file exists with the file name content file name. If that's the case, then we're going to retrieve data from that particular file. And since this is the complete opposite of writing data, what we're now going to do is make use of a stream reader. Again, we're going to pass the stream that is represented by a file in isolated storage. So we're going to open that file, and the file has the name content file name, and we're just going to open that for reading purposes. So what we're going to do is assign the instance variables of our tile data class to the contents of our isolated storage file. And we begin with the show default secondary back content. Now we need to convert that back to a boolean, since that variable is of type boolean, and we stored the information inside our file as a string. So we're just gonna convert that string back to a boolean value. And then the next thing we're gonna do is also store the secondary back content from the contents of that particular file that we created inside isolated storage. And with that, our periodic task has its hands to the contents that were passed by the application in order to show information on the backside of a secondary tile. Now, we also need to make sure that the second property that we have, that it will call that additional method as well. So inside our store show default secondary back content, we're gonna call persist content data, and in the retrieval method we're also gonna make sure that we're gonna call that method to retrieve information from isolated storage, being the method retrieve file content. And with that we have all functionality in place, and since we were just only added a couple of private methods to our tile data class, nothing has to change inside the application or its periodic task in order to now properly communicate between the two of them. So here's the application running, and let's just quickly take a look at the settings screen. Here is a default string that we want to show on the backside of our secondary tile that we are now creating, and let's just wait for that secondary tile to flip over to its backside, and let's take a look if we have that default string visible, which we have as a matter of fact right now. Then we're gonna wait for a little bit until our secondary or our periodic task kicks in, and before our periodic task is kicking in, what we're gonna do is make sure to set a breakpoint on the retrieve tile content method, so we can verify if data is actually being passed right now from the application to our periodic task. So we can just single step through this method, and this method is executed on the process that owns the periodic task. And let's just take a look if our file contains some relevant information. Well, the boolean is set to false, and we have having an even number of tiles string in there, so that looks all good. Now that same method is called again immediately, since we are retrieving two properties. Now this is not an ideal optimal situation, so we could have provided a little bit more code to prevent against accessing that method twice per run of the periodic task. Well, we're not doing that right now to keep that code kind of lean and mean, but there is some optimization possible. So we still have that having an even number of tiles on the start screen visible on the backside of that secondary tile that we created. And once we are running our periodic task again, then we should see a default string visible, and that default string is actually defined inside the periodic task itself. And the reason why we're gonna see that particular default string is because of the fact that the boolean show default secondary back content is now changed, and its value is now true, and earlier it was false. So now we want to show some default string from inside our periodic task, and we want to show that, of course, on the backside of our secondary tile that our EvenTiles application created. So what we're going to do is just continue running inside the debugger, and here is our application visible again, and we're going to remove that breakpoint from inside that method called retrieve tile content, and we're just going to wait for our secondary tile to flip over again, and this happens every 30 seconds. And now you can see we have a default string being click on me to remove me, and that string is coming from our periodic task itself. So we now have an alternate string on the backside of our secondary tile. Now the other thing that we want to show you, or that I need to show you, is that hey, if we activate the application again, and now if we go to our settings screen and we're just going to change that string that we want to display inside the backside of our secondary tile, well, then we immediately should see that modified string right now. So if we're just gonna wait for our secondary tile to flip over again, we now should see a string that was modified by the application being having tiles on my start screen, and that is proof that our application and our periodic task are communicating to each other. And that's about it for EvenTiles for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you soon for the next video of EvenTiles.